It is fair to say that the consequence of that analysis is that by far the preferred outcome is baseload renewables. And one of the reasons that companies like ours spend substantial amounts of money on trying to see whether we can make geothermal energy work is because it would be a baseload source of renewable energy, and we could run it to meet the actual demand for energy, much more to match the demand for energy, because we can choose when to run it and not to run it. And that would be a more effective solution if we can make it work. But my view is we're probably still at least 3 to 5 years away from knowing whether we can make geothermal energy work on a large scale in Australia. In the absence of carbon policies, emissions from electricity generation are projected to grow 45%. So what we call a business as usual, no intervention, grow about 45%. The RET scheme, the renewable energy target, will reduce this growth to 28%. So the mandatory renewable scheme, to the extent that it's fully satisfied, and it is a sort of small point worth making, that the way that renewable energy scheme works is, of course, by way of a penalty payment if one does not acquire the appropriate amount of renewable energy. It is quite conceivable that if the cost of providing that renewable energy exceeds that penalty payment, then, of course, the rational economic decision is to pay the penalty, and we don't necessarily then see the renewable energy, the investments in renewable energy occur. But that's a sort of corollary of the design of the scheme. So the RET scheme will reduce this growth in carbon emissions, all other things being equal, to 28% growth. And bearing in mind we're trying to be at 2000 levels, or 5% below 2000 levels, there's clearly still a very big gap to be closed, and a substantial challenge to achieve the balance of this emissions reduction, which must therefore come effectively from the existing fleet of generation. So we've talked about how effectively the renewable energy target means that the bulk of our new investment in generation for the next 10 years will be in renewable energy, backed up by open cycle gas. That barely gets us halfway towards the energy sector's part of the challenge. And if one holds the view that the energy sector is that area which potentially has the greatest potential to cut emissions at lower cost, then the challenge will be even greater than that. So in the energy sector, the main driver of further emissions reduction, because we have to influence the existing fleet, has to be a price on carbon, that is an ETS. The deferred implementation of an ETS until at least 2013 has a number of consequences. There is now no signal to drive fuel substitution in or the early retirement of the existing fleet. And it's impossible to meet the target we've set for ourselves without fuel substitution in the existing fleet or the retirement of some of that existing fleet of power stations. A deferral beyond 2013 is getting too late to influence investment in generation that's deployable by 2020. So because of the lead time taken to build assets in this sector, if we're not making those decisions by 2013, 14, 15, it's too late. We won't have the capacity we need for 2020. So if in fact we don't have an ETS by 2013, or confidence we will have one, and even if we do much beyond that, it will probably be too late to influence a lot of the build decisions we've got to make, as I say, in those next 3 to 5 years. Furthermore, if uncertainty in the implementation of a carbon price persists, then renewables will become more expensive, because electricity prices will not support the higher terminal values currently ascribed to these projects. And it's important to understand that in the costing of renewable projects, there has to date been a presumption that that other policy lever of an ETS would be there, and the consequence of that lever would be that by the end of the renewable energy target period of 2030, we'd have seen an equilibration, if you like, or a convergence of prices from renewable energies and from our traditional thermal fuels. But if we don't have an ETS, our thermal fuel prices will stay where they are, and that renewable generation at the end of that RET period will therefore be worth a lot less, and relatively more of the value of that investment has to be covered through prices in the intervening period. So there really is some significant effects if the ETS in fact was abandoned as an instrument of policy. In respect to the first 2 points, we believe a relatively low carbon price in the range of $20 to $40 per tonne would have driven substantial gas for coal substitution in the existing fleet. Now, that's not to say coal-fired power stations would now be fired by gas. It is to say that in aggregate there would have been earlier retirement of some of the older, less efficient and less carbon efficient power stations, obviously some of the brown coal stations here in Victoria, and they would be replaced by an accelerated development of gas. And if you think about the lead times that we need to do that, at best it would be 2016, 2017, even if we began that task today, that you'd be able to undertake that change. So time in our industry is a critical driver. We estimate that relative to that option of substituting gas for coal in the existing fleet at a price of around $20 to $40 per tonne, a reduction of carbon emissions through the renewable energy target compared to that scenario is costing us around $40 per tonne of carbon reduced, more than if we went down that path of gas substitution driven by an ETS with a carbon charge in the range of $20 to $40 a tonne. So that renewable energy target in its pure form is, in our view, costing us substantially more as a means for reducing carbon than could have otherwise been the case. And for that reason, I've always found it curious that we've been relatively uncritical in adopting higher cost policies, for example, like the RET and solar feed-in tariffs, than policies whose fundamental design intent was to reduce carbon at the lowest possible cost, which was the policy objective of an ETS. And for all the reasons I've said, put simply, the renewable energy target without an ETS makes no sense. So to the extent that the RET exists, it needs that other lever, that other policy instrument put beside it. The other consequence of our current difficulty in establishing a price on carbon has been a proliferation of schemes designed to reduce carbon emissions across the supply chain, and increasingly at the point of consumption rather than production. So in the absence of our ability to progress, particularly in ETS, not surprisingly, our policymakers and our politicians find doing nothing unacceptable. And of course, they have to do something. That something was measured in 2008. The Wilkins Review identified over 200 state-based and 60 federal-based schemes, all designed to reduce carbon in some way, shape or form. And I can assure you that they still continue to breed at a great rate. And for companies like ours, tracking and complying with all of these targets involves a very significant burden. We, for example, at the moment, we trade electricity, and that's an extensive operation in our business, but we trade over 6 different economic instruments for carbon. And there's an intention to add substantially to the portfolio of carbon instruments that need to be traded. Now, many of these initiatives are well-intentioned, but in our opinion, poorly understood in terms of the cost of those initiatives or the likelihood of achieving their desired effects. There is a reliance, for example, on energy efficiency making a significant contribution to meeting our 2020 targets. Now, we need to make clear that we think improving energy efficiency is an important and worthy objective, but it is unlikely to deliver the aggregate reduction in carbon emissions expected of it. When we look over the last 10 years, we've seen large gains in appliance efficiency. Approximately 30% efficiency improvement for refrigerators, 20% for washing machines, obviously substantial improvements for air conditioning. When we examine our own billing data, the 2001, 2005 and 2009 years were within 1 degree difference in maximum minimum temperature ranges. And so effectively you can use those data points, because they're not influenced by different weather, to look at whether we can see evidence that that improved efficiency that we know is happening in appliances is changing the aggregate consumption. And it is very difficult to see any evidence in the data that supports any material change in average household energy consumption. Peak demand continues to grow throughout Australia, not surprisingly, because we're putting more and more air conditioning in. And whilst there is some evidence that in the shoulders and off-peak periods there is less electricity demand per household, we know that a fair bit of that's migrated to gas for gas hot water, and some of it, of course, to solar hot water. But the impact is still very small and hard to see in the data. So over 10 years, where we have seen substantial improvements in appliance efficiency, we're still not seeing much change in the aggregate demand for energy at a household level. Whilst penetration, and the reason really stems from how we use energy. So whilst penetration of albeit more efficient appliances for cooling, dishwashing and clothes drying continue to grow, and when we say continue to grow, it's an interesting, when one looks at the data, air conditioning has about a 40% appliance penetration, dishwashers similarly, and clothes drying similarly. Not surprisingly, in households we have basically 100% penetration of hot water, for example, in cooking. It is interesting that whilst it's right at the margin, more Australian households have television sets than they do clothes washing machines. So I don't know what that says about our habits, but when you look at the data, that's the facts of the matter. So whilst we've got sectors of appliance or household usage that are underpenetrated, we will continue to see growth in average household consumption, notwithstanding that appliance efficiencies have been improved. And of course, the classic example of that trend today is what we see happening in TVs. I could ask for a quick show of hands as to how many in the audience have flat screen TVs in their home. You can see that there's quite a few already, and I suspect that a great number of you that don't intend to buy one in the near term. But it's not that long ago that houses might have had, albeit inefficient, one or two older TVs. Increasingly, they'll have 2, 3 or 4 flat screen TVs, for example. So whilst appliance efficiency is improving, it's a worthy and important goal. In our view, it will not produce in aggregate reductions and contribute to achievement of our carbon emissions targeted reductions by 2020. This is backed up, by the way, and when I say backed up, it should not be a surprise to us. There's a substantial amount of work now done in the School of Behavioural Economics that makes a point that I suspect we all know to be true, and that is that we like to spend our own surpluses. So whilst at the end of the day we are being presented with appliances that are far more efficient and can reduce to a reduction in the price or the total bill for energy, we of course like to consume that benefit, and as we just evidenced, we almost invariably consume that in more screens, more computers and more appliances in our home. So that's why in part we don't think efficiency will make a contribution to the aggregate reduction target, albeit energy efficiency remains an important tool in the toolkit. Another example we should examine is policies and initiatives around technologies that are commonly grouped under the banner of smart grids, including as a subset smart metering. And again, developments in this area are also an important and worthy objective. There are some very important technologies that are available to us. However, these technologies have different economic and environmental effects depending on the objective being pursued. Many of these technologies, that in broad terms are smart grid technologies, are designed to allow consumers to shift demand by introducing price signals and creating better integration of supply and demand. Consequently, they could lead to a reduction in generation, transmission and distribution investment that provides benefits that support the cost of adopting these new technologies. In other words, by using these technologies, we can reduce the amount of investment in meeting the peak demand for energy, which drives investment in our industry, because we can shift the peaks by giving consumers more information. But if that's all we do, shifting consumption, they do not necessarily result in large, or this does not necessarily result in large changes in the amount of energy consumed. It is shifting our consumption patterns but not necessarily reducing it, and therefore produce little benefit in reducing carbon emissions, because carbon emissions aren't driven by our peak demand for energy, they're driven by how much energy we use. To the extent that these technologies are promoted to consumers as a basis for reducing their energy consumption rather than shifting it, and therefore saving money, then they will have that proportional effect on reducing carbon emissions, but of course at a cost. So if we do use that increased access to information to actually reduce our emissions, then of course reduce our use of energy, then that will of course have the same proportional effect on emissions. But to the extent that the investment in these technologies is promoted to us as consumers as worth doing because we will save money, because we will lose less energy, it's not necessarily as it seems on the surface. And this is because the cost of energy that we pay, so what we pay as consumers on our bill, is approximately 50% comprised of transmission and distribution costs, so the wires and poles that are in place to supply the energy to our households. If throughput is reduced in these are sectors whose returns are rate-based. They're regulated sectors guaranteed a return through the regulatory system. And the consequence of a proportional reduction in consumption is simply a proportional increase in the price, because that's what the rate-based system will do. So at the end of the day, they will not produce, and simplistically, they'll only produce half the benefit in terms of price to consumers, as might on the surface seem to be the case, because underlying transmission and distribution charges will be adjusted to reflect the change in throughput. In Victoria, and to kind of illustrate this effect, in Victoria the smart meter rollout has added approximately $70 to the average electricity bill, which is just over $1,000 per annum. Now, these additional costs clearly are not yet producing a benefit to consumers because they've not been followed up with tariffs that allow consumers to make that choice. And from my point of view, and I know this is potentially a contentious statement, but the mandatory rollout means that all consumers are carrying this cost. And it's a fair contention that many of the smaller energy consumers and the disadvantaged groups are likely to have little capacity to change their energy consumption habits anyway, because they are not great consumers of energy. They do not have substantial discretionary income. So it's our view that many of the initiatives designed to reduce emissions at the point of consumption come at substantially higher cost than reducing emissions at the point of production. Yet that is the direction of public policy in the area of reducing carbon emissions at this point in time. Based on current policy settings, in the absence of an ETS, we would need to see both a 20% reduction in average household energy consumption, and I can tell you that over the last 10 years we've seen hardly any change. So between now and 2020, to meet our target with current policy instruments in place, which is the RET, we would need to see a 20% reduction in average household energy consumption, and as I say, I don't see that occurring, and a doubling of the renewable energy target to close that remaining gap. And for anybody who debates that the target that we've set for our country of 5% reduction by 2020 is not ambitious enough, when you try and operationalise that target, turn it into initiatives that are capable of being implemented, it is a very challenging target. And I guess I would challenge that part of the community that says it's a soft target to look at the data. It's actually a very challenging target for us to make those reductions by 2020. Effective policies causing change at just 20 to 30 points in Australia, that is where our major power stations are, seem to us to have a greater chance of success than relying on millions of Australian households to make substantial changes in the way they use energy. We believe that a deeper understanding of these issues across the energy supply chain would lead to better policy making, and therefore greater likelihood that we will meet the targets that we've set for ourselves for 2020. In particular, given that the RET scheme now exists, it makes no sense to ignore the role that a sensibly designed ETS must play in helping us achieve substantial reductions in carbon emissions. And that begs perhaps the last question: what would a sensible ETS look like? And at least in part, my answer there goes back to what I think of as the economics of climate change. Because the one thing we know for sure is that the cost of delay costs far more than early action. We have always been advocates of putting in place the infrastructure of change, putting in place the tools and mechanisms that will allow us to price carbon. In our industry, because we make decisions with 20, 30 and 40-year economic lives, the implementation of schemes that may have little economic effect but are clear in their design intent sooner is in fact very powerful, because it will substantially change the mix and the decisions and choices we make and the investments we make. But in the absence of a commitment to those changes, we have no guidance. They will not influence our decisions. And we will do what investors normally do in these situations and make the least risky decision we can. We will not run out of energy. We will not have a less reliable system of energy. You will all have the power you need when you want it, but it will be the consequence of the current policy environment, and it will be the consequence of those decisions that risk least capital. And that will not necessarily be the right basis for long-term investment in power generation. So, ladies and gentlemen, in summary, I would say that our ability to meet the targets that we still have, as I say, bipartisan political support for 5% reduction on 2000 levels by 2020 is achievable, but we are actually running out of time simply because of the time it takes to make decisions and implement them in our industry. And we will be best served if we do have those two policy levers in place, the RET and an effective ETS, and the sooner the better. Thank you very much.